I'll invite the panel members to come up. Dr. Noor. So the floor is open for questions, if anyone dares to get up to the microphone. A bit of readjustment there. Oh, wonderful. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ursula Dalrymple, currently unemployed.
We're having problems because so many people are moving in the back. If you could speak up.
Hi, I'm Ursula Dalrymple, currently unemployed. My question is primarily, I guess, for Dr. Noor. So you mentioned that there are several different ways of putting together national malaria case counts, one of which is adjusting routine health facility data, and the other is using these prevalence to incidence models, which both kind of fundamentally estimate different metrics. So the case count estimates malaria positive fevers, and the prevalence to incidence estimates truly symptomatic cases. What do you think is the most important number to estimate here? And is it important that, the difference between these case counts is kind of sometimes unacknowledged? Does that actually matter?
Who would like to tackle that one?
Thank you. I'll first of all start by saying that it matters. The difference matters. Which of the two numbers is important? I think to an epidemiologist who is interested mainly in research and transmission, perhaps malaria attributable fevers might be the thing that matters. But for the health system and health workers who have to deal with individuals who they suspect through a reasonably imperfect algorithm whether they have malaria or not on the basis of a number of symptoms, and then test and treat those individuals. I think that's what matters to them. That's what is funded in the health system. That's what they know as their burden of disease. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And that's what's important to the WHO as well. In terms of contextualizing that with respect to, despite this number of cases, is transmission declining, is the age pattern shifting? Those are other things that need to be done, I think, in terms of operational research and other supportive evidence.
Yes.
I'm Oneling. I'm a Tulane University student, and I'm originally from Ethiopia, and I've been working in surveillance. So my question is, as expected, on surveillance. So I have a little bit of difficulty in understanding transforming surveillance as intervention. So what's intervention? But my question is actually, when we say if we are in a situation like in a resource-limited country, what is the guidance in prioritization? Like, should we strengthen the surveillance system or actually prioritize, again, the actual interventions, which is LA line or RS or things like that? So what is the guidance? And my final question is, what's strong surveillance? I mean, surveillance, it can go from like asking people, do you have fever, all the way up to the presentation about using genetics. So where is strong surveillance? What's strong surveillance? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. 3 questions. What is surveillance as intervention? I think the way to think about it, the way at least I think about it, is to think about the response that you need to mount. And if your surveillance is good enough to mount an effective response, then your surveillance is part of the intervention package. And so that's the way, it's a surveillance that's fit for purpose, and that purpose varies depending on where you are in the transmission continuum. In terms of prioritization, whether to prioritize surveillance or to prioritize interventions, the question really is, how do you effectively prioritize your other interventions if you do not have good surveillance data? And it's a question of avoiding those inefficiencies, which in the short term might make you think that investment in surveillance is very expensive. But in the long term, the losses you make through inefficiencies mean that actually you're not neither achieving the impact you want nor improving and making long-term savings by investing in your surveillance. So that's how you should look at it. What does strong surveillance mean? Again, brings me back to the kind of decisions you have to make. What's the response? What do you want to do? And once you have defined that, does your surveillance system support that? And I think that's how you define what a strong surveillance in your context means. And the generic types of surveillance that the WHO kind of puts out, as you know, differs by the transmission continuum. There's one that's fit for elimination, but there are others that you don't do in countries like Nigeria or DRC. You don't recommend case investigations because you're dealing with a large set of cases. There are other priorities in the surveillance system. And by and large, your passive case detection system is enough to support the decisions you want to make with other things like entomology and occasional household surveys, etc.
Diane, do you want to add anything?
And I would say, you know, I think Noor did a very good job of answering it. And I think the idea, I think, is to have a menu of options available that you can adjust as your situation changes. So the goal, of course, is that, you know, transmission and burden will go down in every country, but that's going to happen in a different time scale. And so having these tools available now means that you can anticipate what kind of surveillance you might need a year from now, 5 years from now. And to comment on the genetic surveillance, I think, again, this is, if we use other diseases as the example, in the final stages of eradication, it's going to be critical to have genetic data to know where infections are coming from, what transmission networks. I think the question is genetic data also useful in a high burden setting? And there, I think, that's a matter of research and a matter of this interface between what question are you asking and how will that help you make a decision in deployment of resources.
Philip, if you could pass the microphone down.
So I had a question for the panel, and a lot of this was around, each of you in a different way brought up this question, which was around uncertainties around health-seeking behavior. And as we think about, it was great to see the themes of data, surveillance as an intervention woven throughout the entire session. When we think about now health-seeking behavior, I loved how Pedro pointed out that there were uncertainties in the numerator and uncertainties in the denominator. What are some of the things, each of you pointed out ways in which, what can we know based on what we have now, and what are the routes to improving this, and how far do we need to go on that? And was wondering if you could comment along those lines.
Yeah, I know that measuring health-seeking behavior may be one of the most difficult tasks that we have, but I do know that several people trying to find methods of accurately estimate how do people behave regarding their health status. Normally, we measure that by asking the people during the surveys if they had fever, and if when they got fever, what they do. This is the classic way of measuring it. But this is also linked to other problems on who we are asking that question, and if we are the population that, for instance, for reactive case detection and response, we mentioned that most of the people that we normally don't find for instance, young men or men that are working outside the place we are acting. And for this specific group, for instance, it's hard to know how do they behave in terms of when they got fever or not. So this is what I think.
I think to try to add to what you said rather than repeat what you said, which I completely agree with, I think there's a big need to understand symptomaticity in the first place and whether the question, did you have fever in the last 2 weeks, is the right question always. Of course, in modeling, it's really important to understand just what is going on in the first place and what might trigger health seeking in the model. But I think fundamentally that's kind of a basic biology and epidemiology question that we don't quite understand yet.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that, and I don't think it's an easy nut to crack at all. I think there's opportunities to make relatively rapid gains in our information that we have available. We could do more than just ask, have you had a fever in the last 2 weeks? And then a very limited set of questions as follow-up to that. Maybe not rolled out across all household surveys, but piloted in specific places. We could really drill down a lot more and then triangulate that back against the more widely applied survey questions. I think that, there's missed opportunities in cross-sectional surveys to get a little bit more information that would be helpful. We do need to be creative here, I think.
All right.
No, I agree with what everyone else has said so far. I also wanted to just comment on the fact that we tend to focus on a fever and whether it's been treated or not, but we ignore the decision to actually seek treatment. And measuring that isn't necessarily the strength of quantitative epidemiologists. It's something that is probably done best in the social sciences by anthropologists and others. And bringing the various disciplines to understand what makes a person make a specific decision as to whether to seek treatment or not is key. One of the things we ignore from the household surveys, and we can't define actually in the household surveys, is delayed decision making. What proportion of people who have not sought treatment today are going to seek treatment in the coming days? And that might be a big proportion of the so-called not seeking treatment.
Question?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask a question, particularly about the modeling work and training it to respond to different kinds of interventions. I was thinking even in the context of Zambia, that in Lusaka, where there's been so much development and infrastructure and drainage and areas that used to have malaria that don't because there's a mall there now, I'm wondering if there would be a way to model other kinds of multi-sectoral interventions and the effect that those pieces may have, whether it's rural electrification projects, whether it's proper drainage and construction and agriculture, et cetera, just to, I guess, ask what you thought the potential of coming up with training models to respond to multi-sectoral interventions and to get your response. Thank you.
Wow, I would love to just tell my model add hydroelectric dam and see what happens. But what you're referring to here is, what is the impact on development and projects like this on say, like the availability of habitat for the vector, because that's what's changing, right? When you're paving systems, you're like, Anopheles can no longer live there. So the challenge for the question like that is that I would need some information about just what is going on. Are you paving over 100% of the breeding sites within what square kilometer region? How fast is that going? Does that have implications for what different vector species might now find the place more habitable? So, the model, I can do anything, but I don't want to do anything. I want to do something that's actually realistic. So it's a challenge for people who gather data to be able to tell me what are you seeing in the field?
Well, I have a very simple question, because we pulled together this group because we got to wondering about what the state of the malaria world was and how to understand it. And as we were talking about how to understand it, you first got to start by what you're measuring, and then how you take that information. I'm very simple. How you take that information and interpret it. And each of you have spoken about it in slightly different ways. So I'd like you to take a step back and say, based on the kind of data that you're talking about, whether you're visualizing it, measuring it, modeling it, are things getting better or are things getting worse? Dr. Noor, you will be last. Since we don't really, I'm not really asking for a peek into the World Malaria Report 2018, but I'm saying based on what you're seeing and the analysis that you're each doing, and maybe Pete, you just did a whole lot of mapping,
Yeah.
and you just finished this 2018 report. Where do you think we're going?
You know, I think broadly the storyline that's emerged in the last year or two is the right one. It's that, you know, we have seen rapid progress, and now we're not seeing rapid progress. Now, whether we're flatlining, whether we're going down slightly more slowly, whether we're getting slightly up, you know, we maybe don't really have the precision to differentiate those scenarios, but it almost doesn't matter. We're slowing down. Okay, in key places. We're not slowing down everywhere by any means. There's many storylines happening around the world, many of which are heading exactly where we want them to head. In the heartland of high endemic Africa, at the moment, the story seems to be one of deceleration of progress. I would probably stop there in terms of my assessment.
Okay. Jolene, you've got large data sets, many more than what you were able to tell in such a brief story. How are we doing?
I actually just feel really hopeful. You know, I think we know more now about malaria than we ever did. And it's better to know that we've stalled than to not know we've stalled. And we know more about the stalling than we could have known 5 years ago. We have new models, we have more data. We're very much energized to doing something about it. So ultimately, you know, I think I feel really positive about what we can do, even though the problem is clearly a really serious one.
Pedroide, you're working in southern Mozambique. Mozambique is one of the top 10 countries, but you're working in a very special area and have put in a set of interventions. How do you think things are going?
For me, I think it's both simple and complex, and it depends on the level of expertise of the person who sees or reads the data. For Mozambique, for instance, if we are talking about all these high-tech data has been presented here, if we see that this is posed to a program officer in a district like Magudi who doesn't understand a lot of it, it will be complicated, and he can ignore completely, even if the data is well informative. But if that is translated into a very simple way of explaining what that means and accompanied by a set of responses that could be chosen to act against that data, I think it could be easy. So for me, as much simple the ways of showing the data is, it will be well accepted and used.
Okay, thank you. Diane, you do not have all the data points you would like. You would love to collect more data points, but based on the areas that you're working on, how are we doing?
You know, I would say I agree with the comment that we now know much better where we stand. I would say that previously, I think the solidness of the data prior to the last 4 or 5 years is probably in question. Not to say it's completely inaccurate, but now I think we are starting to figure out what we know and what we don't know. And I'm very hopeful that we made progress. There's no question. I think that there is a challenge. I think we have kind of reached a point where we've applied with as much, you know, sort of intensity as is possible under current conditions, the tools that we have. And so I think we're ready for a pivot. We're ready for a change in how we look at things, and we have much more data and much more integration of data and much more realization what the data is telling us.
Dr. Noor, final word.
As hopeful as everyone else. And I think there's no question we are in a much better place than we were in 2000 or around 2000. But it's about making progress. And the data suggests that over the last 3-4 years, that progress has stalled. And now it's about how do we, as Diane says, pivot again towards further progress. I think that's the discussion here. It's not, there's no question that we're in a significantly better place than we were before. The only thing that sometimes I find a little bit regrettable is we haven't really made use of the data and the tools available to us that we could have used 2-3 years ago to ensure that we do not revert in some settings, to be more efficient with the way we do things and more alert and really accelerate towards further gains. And I think the response should be around how best do we use those tools.
We have one last question.
Hi, I'm Bagvi Rao from Médecins Sans Frontières. The words that I hadn't heard anyone say at the moment are refugees, conflict, and people in flight. And we know, even from the last World Malaria Report, that levels of, that malaria is resurgent in many conflict areas, and that we're seeing it in Yemen and Rwanda and places that we thought had really reduced. How are your incredible sort of tools and capabilities that you've been talking about so far, how are they going to capture what is happening in Eastern DRC or South Sudan? And are these numbers therefore being massively underestimated in these reports, and therefore are these hotspots being forgotten?
Perhaps that's Dr. Noor.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We, as the Global Malaria Program, have been closely working with other departments in WHO that are responsible for emergency response to look at the burden of malaria among refugees. In a paradoxical way, the information about malaria in refugees is probably more solid than the information about malaria in the wider population. And in some settings, the response more appropriate than it is in the wider population settings, notwithstanding the tragedy of conflict. And I do not mean to say that this is happening everywhere. But more broadly, conflict has played a significant role, I would say, in countries like the DRC, in South Sudan, in Yemen more recently, to reverse all the gains that have been made over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And that really is, among the many other tragedies, the real malaria tragedy.
To finish off this session, I would like to invite Abhilasha Karki up to the podium. I'm assuming she's here. She was shy, she was standing in the back. As you know, if you went to the session last night, Abhilasha is our new Alan J. Magil Fellow. And in recognition of that, Philip has the new ASTMH Alan J. Magil medal to give her.
On this medal it says, honoring the legacy of Alan J. Magil, leadership, commitment, inspiration, and excellence. Congratulations.
Now, I think that means she'll be speaking next year. You can now worry about it for the next year, just like the rest of us. Do you want to say anything?
I really want to say thank you very much. I feel really honored at this great opportunity that I have, and I really look forward to talking next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Wait a second. There's a little... Thank you, everybody, for staying till the end, and thank you to the panelists for a great session. This has really been a great learning experience. See you next year.